Professor William Hamblin from the Department of History, and Professor David Rolph Seeley from the Department of Ancient Scriptures as our featured speakers. They are the joint authors of a new book being published this spring by Thames and Hudson, USA, on Solomon's Temple. Their address for us is entitled Solomon's Temple in History and Myth. The library sponsors two main lectures and lecture series, the House of Learning Lecture Series and the Alice Louise Reynolds Women in Scholarship Lecture. Through these lectures, the library brings together scholars and students to engage in a civil discussion of ideas, and in so doing, the library contributes to building a learned community which fosters the faithful life of the mind. The House of Learning Lecture Series title is taken from the 88th section of the Doctrine and Covenants, verse 119, where the Lord instructs the saints to prepare every needful thing, even a house of learning. Because the library is the campus repository for the literature of all academic disciplines and scholarship, the library is well positioned to be considered BYU's House of Learning. The Harold B. Lee Library takes seriously its campus role as the intellectual heart of inquiry and knowledge, and is honored to provide this House of Learning lecture today. Now, about today's speakers. Professor Bill Hamblin earned a bachelor's degree from BYU in 1978 and an MA and PhD degrees in history from the University of Michigan in 1981 and 1985, respectively. He is a scholar of classics and teaches classes in the history of the ancient world, as well as classes in Islam and the Crusades. He is the author of several books, including a recent one on warfare in the ancient Middle East. He has published over 20 articles associated with the Neil A. Maxwell Institute of Religious Scholarship. Professor David Rolph Seeley has a baccalaureate in Greek and a master's degree in classics from BYU, earned in 1981 and 1982, and an arts master's and a PhD degree in ancient and biblical studies from the University of Michigan in 1985 and 1990. Professor Seeley is an expert on the Dead Sea Scrolls and currently is the first recipient and holder of the Ancient Studies Professorship at BYU. His publications have appeared in Farms and in BYU Studies. Both of these professors provide clarion examples for their students of the faithful, inquiring mind. It is a great pleasure to welcome our House of Learning lecture speakers today, Professors Bill Hamblin and David Rolph Seeley.
Hello, I'm Professor Seeley. Solomon's Temple was a building, a real building, built in a real place in a real time on Mount Moriah in Jerusalem in 968 BC. Our presentation today is the history of this building and its origins in the ancient Near East, and its history throughout biblical history of Israel. But our book and this lecture is not just the story of the temple in this particular place and time, but the story of an idea whose origin lies before the dawn of history and whose culmination extends beyond the apocalyptic twilight of mankind. It is the idea that God can dwell with us and that his indwelling is symbolically represented by his temple. For nearly half of mankind, Jews, Christians, and Muslims, the site of the temple remains one of the most sacred spots on earth. The influence of the Temple of Solomon on history, culture, religion, ritual, music, mysticism, art, and architecture has been enormous. Politically, wars have been fought and continue to be fought for exclusive control of this sacred space. But primarily, Solomon's Temple epitomizes the idea of the golden, ever sought-for moment when God dwells among us. In our discussion today, I want to just bring up 4 very simple ideas that we find resonating throughout all of the times and periods of temples. Number 1, the temple is primarily the dwelling place of God on earth, or the gateway of God's dwelling in his heavenly temple. Number 2, the presence of God is often associated with a primordial garden, the Garden of Eden in the Jewish and Christian and Muslim tradition, accompanied by symbols of trees and living water and protected and guarded by cherubim. Number 3, the temple consists of gradated sacred space, creating for worshipers a journey towards the presence of God. And finally, number 4, the journey to the presence of God is often mediated by priesthood and consists of prayers and sacrifices. We want to trace really quickly the origins of temple worship in the Old Testament. We can do this quickly because these are things you're familiar with. The first temple that we have mentioned in the Old Testament, oddly enough, is the Tower of Babel, an attempt to reach into heaven through technology and through arrogance without worship and without the proper sacrifices to God. This reminds us, at least architecturally, of the kinds of ascending architecture that we have in the ziggurats, leading a person towards God in his heavenly temple. The second story is also well known, the story of Abraham and his son Isaac, and God calling him to a place, Mount Moriah, which will be the traditional site of the temple in Jerusalem, where Abraham is commanded to sacrifice his son. This is an early depiction of a medieval synagogue art. Later, we see this Akedah, or the binding of Isaac, depicted in the synagogue with the facade of a temple and with the menorah, as you can see on the left-hand side. This shows us that in the synagogue at least, and particularly in religious discussion, we have a collocation of this sacrifice of Abraham with the sacrifice at the temple. For Jews, the story remains the story of faith and obedience. For Christians, it becomes a story of the sacrifice of the substitutionary nature, where God will provide the sacrifice, and thus all sacrifice at temples for Christians become types and shadows of the coming of the true sacrifice of Jesus Christ. The third story from the Bible is Bethel. On this site, Jacob prayed to the Lord, and he had a vision of the ladder, Jacob's ladder, ascending to heaven, and with angels going up and down on this ladder. On this occasion, Jacob made the comment, "This indeed is the gate of heaven," one of the really important titles of temples and temple worship in the Old Testament. This event is memorialized on the Bath Abbey, and if you're really going to say this right, you have to say the Bath Abbey, the abbey that shows us these angels going up and down the ladder. Of interest to folklorists is the tradition that the stone from Bethel, the so-called Stone of Destiny, or the Scone Stone, became part of the coronation chair in Westminster Abbey. And this chair, throne, became the place where most all of the kings of England were coronated since Edward I in 1307. And you can see at the foot of this throne are the lions that were also at the throne of King Solomon. 1200. Around 1200, we have the predecessor of Solomon's temple, the tabernacle. Moses ascended on Mount Sinai and received by revelation the exact parameters and specifications of this building. Also known from the ancient Near East are stories. Here we have the statue of Gudea of Lagash, who also received by revelation the plan of the temple that he was to build, of a Sumerian temple. This is a wonderful medieval illustration of the children of Israel at the foot of Mount Sinai and the building and the beginning of the function of the tabernacle. You all know that the tabernacle is gradated sacred space, and it creates for us the journey towards God. The journey contains many symbols. It contains veils. You see the veil with the cherubim on the outside here. You see the altar. You see the laver with the water and the veil to enter into the tabernacle. Of interest in gradated sacred space is if we were to mathematically put this space out on a piece of paper, you would see that the center part of the left quadrant, the center of this is the Holy of Holies, where God manifests himself to humans. On the right-hand side, you see that the center part of the mirror image of this quadrant is the sacrificial altar, where man goes to offer his sacrifices to God. You can see the journey includes the incense altar, the showbread table, the menorah, and another veil, a veil guarded by cherubim and other elements of garden imagery which will be developed in Solomon's temple. Inside the Holy of Holies, the perfect cube, we have the symbol of the exact presence of God, this wonderful Ark of the Covenant, which is known as the footstool or the throne of God in ancient Israel. Reminds us of other examples we have in the ancient world of portable arks, of a people on the move that are permitted by deity to take the presence of God with them as they travel. The priests preside, and the primary offering given at this tabernacle is the sacrifice, the blood sacrifice offered on the altar, presided over by the priests. In 968, we have the conquest of Jerusalem by David, and we have Solomon, who takes this wonderful city of Jerusalem and builds on its highest point, the Temple of Solomon. And this building then becomes the point of our entire lecture. This building will stand from 968 to 586, at which point it will be destroyed. Destroyed actually forever. It will be replaced by two other temples, which we'll talk about in just a moment. Solomon's temple was one of the grand buildings of the ancient Near East, and Solomon, upon dedicating this building, makes a really interesting comment. He says to the Lord, he says, "We realize this is a house built with hands on earth, but it represents the opportunity for those who come to worship here to turn their hands and their hearts towards the heavenly temple." And thus this temple, as the gate of heaven, unites the heavens with the earth in terms of God's presence. Here we have an illustration of the sacred space inside this temple. We have lots of description from the text of this temple, but we're not exactly sure what the implements looked like in this temple. But we do have similar kinds of implements attested elsewhere in the ancient Near East. Here we see some cherub-type animals. We see the 4 rivers of water, of living water, and we see the trees. We have ample evidence of lots of the same kinds of implements in other kinds of temples in the area and from the time period of King Solomon's temple that we can use as some sort of a model for these. You're probably familiar somewhat with the priestly vestments. The priests, because they have priesthood, are allowed to go directly inside the Temple of Solomon, but only the high priest on the Day of Atonement is allowed to go into the actual presence of God, passing through the veil into the Holy of Holies, or the most holy place, where he will offer upon the altar the sacrifice, atoning or redeeming for the sins of the repentant people outside, and thus uniting the people in a word that William Tyndale coined, at-one-ment, the process of at-one-ment that can happen through this sacred day on the Day of Atonement. Throughout the time of the Temple of Solomon in ancient Israel, there were other temples. Some of these temples were apostate temples. They worshiped golden bulls here, the temple in Dan, when 10 of the tribes divided from the 2 tribes in the south and created this. We also have attested other temples, a reconstruction of a temple at Arad, and the Arad temple was a temple to Jehovah, the Lord God of Israel, and we have really quite an astonishing find there, and if you look carefully, you'll see how the altar, we have the altar in front of this place, and at the very rear of this, you will be able to see the Holy of Holies here. Cube-shaped room with 2 altars as you enter in there, and we'll go back and let you see that. Let's see. You can see how this has been reconstructed from that. The people with these other temples began to incorporate aspects of worship from the surrounding Canaanite worship, most notably the worship of Baal and Asherah. This, of course, didn't please the prophets, didn't please the Lord, and the Lord prophesied through his prophets that unless they cleansed the temple, they would be destroyed. The famous story of this is an Ethiopic manuscript of Josiah. King Josiah called to cleanse the temple at the time of Jeremiah and the time of Lehi, actually. Josiah then cleansed the temple, and for a short period of time, it continued to function cleansed of all of these pagan elements. As you know, in 586, the temple was destroyed by the Babylonians, and the people were taken into exile. In the meantime, there's a prophet named Ezekiel, and Ezekiel lives on the banks of the river Kebar in Babylon, and Ezekiel makes a wonderful discovery, and that is that he can experience the heavenly temple, not by going to Jerusalem and going to the earthly temple, but by experiencing in vision the presence of God. And Ezekiel's vision of the heavenly throne of God with the 4 cherub faces and with the wheels becomes a model for future people seeking for the presence of God that don't depend on physical temples built with hands. Solomon's temple is destroyed in 586. Zerubbabel's temple was built from 515, and it stood until 19 BC, at which time a man named Herod the Great in large part because he was a great builder, built this spectacular temple. The temple that would last for until 70 AD, that would be destroyed by the Romans. This temple would be the temple of the time of Jesus. It would be the temple that existed at the early stages of Rabbinic Judaism, and it was a temple, oddly enough, that existed at the same time as the Essenes and the peoples of the Dead Sea Scrolls. There's a wonderful set of sacred space here. In the outer courts, all of the people of the world were invited here to worship the Lord God of Israel. This is called the Court of the Gentiles. The Court of the Gentiles has a sign here that warns anyone who is not a member of the house of Israel from passing these walls, lest they forfeit their lives. Within this sacred space, you will see this is the court of the women. Both the men and the women could come here to participate in the sacrifices by watching. They could ascend up into here, and the men of ancient Israel could enter this gate into the court of the Israelite men here, and then this was the court of the priests into this building and into, of course, the three other rooms inside that building. There's an interesting development. In about 150 BC, the people that became the writers of the Dead Sea Scrolls, they left Jerusalem. They believed that Jerusalem was apostate and that the temple was done by people that had neither the authority nor the correct rules for worship of the Lord. Therefore, they went into the community and they declared that their community would stand henceforth for a temple of men, a temple of a body, of a community that could worship their God and enjoy his presence without a physical temple. One of their texts did have the description, the temple scroll, of a future temple to be built before the coming of the Messiah that would then welcome the Messiah and the end of time. But here we have a temple, not the Jerusalem temple, and this text was written while the Jerusalem temple still stood. In 70 AD, as you know the story, Titus and the Romans destroyed this temple. They took the Jews away. And now we need to talk very quickly about the Jews in the temple in medieval Judaism. Number one, and there's 6 points to this. The first reflex among the Jews in 70 AD was to rebuild the temple as soon as possible. And in 135 AD, a Messiah arose who called himself Bar Kokhba, the son of the star. And on the coins that he published, and he led an armed insurrection against Rome, he published a picture of the facade of Herod's temple with the promise to his followers that they would rebuild the temple and enjoy the presence of God in their midst. The second way, and this of course was a failure, he was killed. The rabbinic Jewish leaders that followed him had to realize they had followed a false Messiah, and this hope was largely abandoned within the immediate time period of the destruction of the temple. The second way is that the temple remains central in Judaism is by pilgrimage. And here we have a wonderful depiction of the site of the destruction of the temple, which lay barren for many, many years until the coming of the Muslims in 638. The Christians deliberately kept this place with one stone not standing upon another as a symbol to the Jews that their temple had been destroyed. Jews began a process of pilgrimage there. Here's the medieval inscription that you can see in Jerusalem this day. Thou you shall see the temple and your heart shall rejoice. And this pilgrimage continues to the present day with the Jews going to the western wall to offer their prayers as close as they can get to the temple. Number three, the temple becomes implanted in Jewish memory, and it does it largely through texts. We have the prophecy that the Messiah would come on a donkey. You know that story from Christian versions, but there's a Jewish illustrated manuscript of the Messiah coming on a donkey to restore the temple. And the idea was until he came, we had to keep a good record of this. And this is a picture of a tractate written by Maimonides, Avodah, a very, very long tractate, who documents all of the services of the temple that need to be remembered until that time were to come when the temple could be restored. There's a great deal of Jewish art in these manuscripts of the temple implements to remind them of the significance of these in terms of past history for future reference in the future when the temple would be restored. Number four, the temple and the synagogue. At the time of Jesus, there were hundreds of synagogues in Jerusalem. They coexisted with the temple. Therefore, we know that synagogues were not invented to replace the temple. They were invented to supplement the temple. and in fact, this is the synagogue from Capernaum, the temple began to adopt some of the forms of worship that had been known at the temple, forms of worship like prayer and study and communal celebration of the festivals. But what can you not do at a synagogue? A sacrifice. Sacrifices only can be done at the temple, which means that the synagogue does not replace the temple. It merely takes over some of the forms of worship from the temple. And these synagogues are all oriented towards Jerusalem in a way that the temple is always in the memory of those who worship there. Synagogue art always has temple symbols that we've seen this. No one's for sure if this is the ark or the tabernacle or the flying chariot throne of God with wheels. And we've seen this picture already, the remembrance of the temple in synagogues. Finally, we have mystics in the celestial temple. Kabbalistic Jews took the challenge of Ezekiel to seek for and to find God through mysticism and to go to the celestial temple using their various exercises, using their minds, and to be able to enjoy the experience of the presence of God through Kabbalistic Judaism. Number 6, and most simple, there is a group of people in the Holy Land today that continue to offer sacrifice without a temple, the Samaritans, who continue to do Passover and sacrifice. Finally, the temple in the New Testament. As you know, for Christians, Jerusalem always remains the center of the universe, and early Christian maps will remind us of that constantly, and thus the temple is a very important part of Christianity as well. The temple in Luke chapter 1, the temple is the scene of the Annunciation of the birth of John, and it happens as Zacharias is in the temple lighting the menorah in the holy place. This is a wonderful Christian piece that shows on the left the Annunciation to Mary, and on the right the Annunciation given to John, because as you know in the story, John will foreshadow the coming of the Messiah, and thus Mary and Elizabeth are very, very closely associated in these stories. There is an early tradition in Christianity that Mary was working at the temple, and that in fact the Annunciation of Mary occurred at the temple. This is not a New Testament story, but it's a very early story. But we wanted to mention that story because something really spectacular happens in the New Testament that doesn't happen in the Old Testament. And that is that God's presence comes to earth in a body. And Jesus Christ, as God, comes to earth as a baby, and here's a wonderful picture of Mary presenting him at the temple. Throughout his ministry, Jesus used temple symbolism to teach who he was. I've got this picture to show you. This is the court of the women. And Mary and Joseph would have presented Jesus to the priest here. They would have met Anna and Simeon here. They would have purchased the sacrifice that then would have been taken through the doors here and offered on the altar there that they could have watched the priest do that. Jesus taught he was the true vine. Many people believe this is the vine at the front of Herod's temple. Jesus taught that he was the light of the world at the Feast of Tabernacles. Jesus cast out the money changers from the temple, and he taught that this was his Father's house. Finally, Jesus came as the sacrificial lamb, and he came as the high priest. And Paul teaches us that Jesus, as the high priest, walked into the Holy of Holies, and he offered there his blood, thus redeeming all mankind to making it possible for all to go back to the presence of God. Finally, John, in the book of Revelation, sees a vision in which he sees the holy city of Jerusalem, the journey for which all Christians aspire to be there in that holy city. And he saw that in the center of this city, there was no temple, for the Lord Almighty and the Lamb were the temple. And thus, the temple remains the centerpiece of the spiritual journey of Christianity.
The question I'd like to look at now is how these ideas of the temple were transformed into many different permutations during the Middle Ages and into the modern time. The medieval Christians understood the temple in many different ways, and we'll just overview a few of these. When Constantine is converted to Christianity, Jerusalem becomes a Christian city, but rather than rebuilding the Temple Mount, they left it desolate in order to keep the fulfillment of Christ's prophecy. This is the Madaba map of Jerusalem. You can see the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is now the center of the city rather than the temple, and the Temple Mount, which would be up here, is empty. So Christians understood the importance of the temple, but essentially transferred that importance to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Churches then became surrogate temples, and this is reflected in many different ways. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem is the most important of these. At Easter time, there's a celebration called the Holy Fire, in which the Patriarch of Jerusalem enters into the tomb of Christ and returns with a fire with which he lights the candles of the worshipers, representing the light of God flowing out throughout the entire world. So the entrance of the high priest into the Holy of Holies at the Day of Atonement in the Jewish temple is transformed into the Patriarch entering the tomb on Easter Day. Eusebius, a famous early Christian scholar, has a detailed speech of dedication at the Cathedral of Tyre in which he correlates every element of the cathedral and the bishop and the ritual with ancient Near Eastern temple rituals. The Holy Sepulchre as the Holy of Holies is reflected in other ways as well. Here you can see the Holy Sepulchre, the tomb, the angel sitting before it, the Marys, and Christ ascending into heaven with the Father reaching through the clouds to accept Christ into heaven there. Another famous cathedral that is closely tied with the temple is Justinian's Hagia Sophia. This was in Constantinople, and there Justinian explicitly attempted to rebuild Solomon's temple, although it looks nothing to us like that. It was symbolically supposed to represent Solomon's temple, and he famously claimed when the work was finished, "Solomon, I have outdone thee. I've built something grander than even Solomon's temple." The liturgy of medieval Christians was widely understood to be simply a transformation of the temple liturgy of the Jews. This is a long passage from Germanos, St. Germanos of Constantinople on the divine liturgy. And just to highlight a few ideas, the church is the temple, the canopy represents the Holy of Holies, the chancel barrier is the veil, the bishop is the high priest, the Eucharist is the sacrifice, the church is the true temple. I mean, clearly he's taking all the biblical imagery of the temple and transforming it into a Christian setting. This is called typology. It is using one set of symbols and applying them to another set of ideas and making a correlation or an allegorical correlation between the two. This can be reflected, for example, in this scene where the Eucharist altar is seen as also this place where Abel offered sacrifice, but also Melchizedek. And behind Melchizedek is the first and true temple of Jerusalem. Although Solomon is said to have built the temple, according to Josephus, Melchizedek had built an earlier temple there. And for the Christians, Melchizedek is a Gentile. The first and true temple then is a Gentile temple, as expanded then later in Christian churches. You can see this typology reflected in all sorts of Christian art. This is a 13th century depiction. Here you have Solomon building his temple, which you'll note is the Dome of the Rock. And here you have Christ building the cathedral. So temple and cathedral, they're parallel ideas. The man who most greatly expanded upon this idea is Bede, who wrote 2 books on the tabernacle and on the temple, in which he goes into exquisite detail with every single stone and facet of the temple, reflecting something about Christ and something about the Christian church. Medieval painters consistently depicted the temple as a Christian cathedral or a Christian building. Here is Fouquet, a 15th century painter, whose painting depicts the building of Solomon's temple, and yet, of course, it's a medieval cathedral. In the sanctuary of Christian churches was viewed as the Holy of Holies. And this is an apse mosaic on the roof of a sanctuary of a church in France, in which you have the Ark of the Covenant and twin cherubim angels flanking it. This is exactly what's described in the Holy of Holies in the biblical accounts. Also, you have a baptismal font here, also from 13th or 12th century France, which uses the motif of the brazen sea with the 12 oxen holding up the baptismal font here. So the correlation of the biblical brazen sea as a place of purification with baptism. Another concept was that the functioning of the liturgy on earth was a reflection and parallels the liturgy in heaven. So here you have an orchestra playing in the cathedral, playing sacred music and hymns and psalms and so forth, and they're accompanied by the angels in heaven who sing along with them. So there's a complete parallel between what we do on earth and what's done in heaven, and again, that reflects Jewish traditions. Another typology is of Christ in the Ark of the Covenant. This is a very interesting depiction of a stained glass window from Saint-Denis in the 13th century in France. You have the Ark of the Covenant here, it says that here in Latin. The rod of Aaron is transformed into the crucifix, Christ is the God enthroned on the ark, but it is also transformed into the wheeled throne of Ezekiel, with the wheels here, and the 4 cherubim surrounding this. So, Ezekiel's cherub throne, the Ark of the Covenant, the crucifixion, they all get merged typologically and symbolically by medieval Christians. And this is reflected, for example, in Richard of St. Victor's book, The Mystical Ark, in which he goes on and on about all the mystical meaning of the Ark to medieval Christians. The Christians actually took control of the Temple Mount during the Crusades. They ruled it for almost 100 years, and they called the Dome of the Rock the Templum Domini, the Temple of the Lord. And for then a century, the temple was in fact a Christian church. Here is a depiction of the map of Jerusalem in Crusader times. Down below here you have the Templars driving off the Saracens, and then here you have the Temple of the Lord, or the Temple of Solomon, which were considered 2 separate buildings. This is the Palace of Solomon. Here you have the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and the Tower of David, which was the castle and palace of the king. So the temple then becomes a key shrine in the Crusader times, and was the second most important church on the pilgrim path taken by all Crusaders and all pilgrims during the Crusades. Of course, the temple became the headquarters of the famous Templar Knights, who was a monastic military order, and this is their seal, where you have the knights on one side and you have the Dome of the Rock as the Temple of Christ on the other side. And here it says, the seal of the Knights of the Temple of Christ. And so they're completely taking over this temple imagery into a Christian setting. The rock in the current Dome of the Rock was turned into an altar by the Crusaders, where they performed Mass. And Arcadius of Arosea wrote a famous tractate called On the Temple, in which he tells the whole sacred story of the temple, and they put murals and so forth, mosaics and paintings on the walls depicting all the biblical events associated with the temple. So the Muslim Dome of the Rock is simply transformed into the Christian temple. Interestingly also, Christians in Africa continued the tradition of temple ideology into their own social context as well. Here we have the Ark of the Covenant and Lalibela in Ethiopia. The Ethiopians are, of course, Christians, and they have an ancient tradition that the Ark of the Covenant was taken by David Menelik, the son of Solomon, by the Queen of Sheba, was taken to Ethiopia and has been kept there ever since. And their tradition is that in this little shrine next to the Church of Mary of Zion, the true Ark of the Covenant rests. So that they're taking these biblical traditions and applying them to their own context. Also, the King Lalibela, who is also an Ethiopian saint, the story of his life recounts the vision that he has where he ascends into heaven. Here's Lalibela, and here's the Lord seated on the throne in heaven. And he is given a vision of celestial Jerusalem with the celestial temple there. And he is told to replicate that on earth, which he does in the building of the rock-cut churches at Lalibela, which the Ethiopians called New Jerusalem. So this is the heavenly Jerusalem brought to earth through the vision of Lalibela. And here you can see they cut numerous churches, several dozen, there in this beautiful kind of mountainous site with all these wonderful rock-cut churches. Now, the Muslims also took over the Solomonic temple traditions and had their own permutation and interpretation of what it meant within their context. And that's what we'll look at next for a couple of minutes. The Quran itself speaks of Solomon frequently. You remember, the Muslims are a biblical tradition, and they believe in all the biblical prophets and in Jesus and so forth. They consider them all true prophets, and Solomon was one of those. The Quran then describes the building of Solomon's temple in some of the verses, and it has a very interesting permutation on this. There is a text called the Testament of Solomon, which talks about Solomon building the temple by binding the demons and forcing them to be his laborers, so that the demons work and build the temple for him. And here's an Islamic manuscript with Solomon, here's the temple, and these are the demons who are carrying the rocks and building the temple for Solomon. So this is an old 1st century AD Jewish tradition that gets picked up in the Quran, where it reads, God made a spring of molten bronze to flow for Solomon. This is to provide all the bronze for building the temple. And some of the jinn, these are demons, to work for him by the will of the Lord. Any of the jinn who disobeyed, we made them taste the fire of hell. And the jinns made for him whatever he desired. So the building of Solomon's temple then is recounted, but with this kind of apocryphal twist. The Muslims also remembered the tale of the destruction of the temple by Nebuchadnezzar. And this is a Muslim illustration of this, but notice that the building is the Dome of the Rock. Clearly, they understood the Dome of the Rock as the temple. And here you can see the crescent moon on the top being chopped down. And here's Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king, destroying it. From the Muslims' perspective, the destruction of the temple represented God's rejection of the Jews, and when the Muslims come and take Jerusalem, they are the new chosen people of God, and so they rebuild the temple as the Dome of the Rock. So this story was of great importance to the Muslims. Another element in the temple in Muslim ideology is Muhammad's ascent into heaven. According to this tradition, which is briefly mentioned in the Quran, Muhammad was taken by an angel from Mecca to Jerusalem. There he met with the angelic former prophets and led them in prayer, and then was brought by God to ascend into heaven and entered into the presence of God and have a vision of God. So it's very interesting. He starts in Mecca, but goes to Jerusalem and ascends to heaven from Jerusalem. So here you have the Temple of Jerusalem. Here is the ladder of Jacob's vision of this ladder that ascends into heaven. Here are the seven heavens with the tree of life and so forth in them. And then this is the patriarch Abraham who greets Muhammad as he ascends into heaven. Here's another version of this, a painting from the 16th century. You can see here Muhammad riding this kind of angelic celestial steed who is taking him up into heaven. The angels are flying around in the clouds. The window of heaven is open, and the angels are peering through. And down below you have the Kaaba, where this is the holy shrine in Mecca, and the Temple of Jerusalem to which Muhammad went. Here he is leading the other prophets in prayer, representing his authority and superiority over the other prophets. When Muhammad ascends into heaven, he is brought to the celestial temple where God dwells, closely paralleling the ideas of Jewish mystics and also some ideas you find in the book of Hebrews and Revelation in the New Testament. Here Muhammad encounters the angels. They open up the veil and they permit him to pass into the presence of God beyond the veils of the temple. Temple ideologies were also directly transferred from Solomon's temple to the Kaaba, which became a sacred shrine more important to the Muslims than the site of Jerusalem. Here is the Kaaba at Mecca. It's a site of great pilgrimage. But if you go through and try to understand what the symbolic meaning of all the elements of the Kaaba and Mecca are, you can see very close parallels to Solomon's temple and ideologies associated with that. This is clear in a book by F.F. Peters called Mecca and Jerusalem, where he compares the sacred nature and symbols of both of those. Here is the Kaaba itself, the most sacred shrine said to have been built by Abraham as the first temple. And notice it's in the shape of a perfect cube, which parallels the Holy of Holies, this cube as the perfect form for the shrine in which God can dwell. The Kaaba also has a veil called the Kiswa, which is put around it just like the veil of the Temple of Jerusalem. So lots of ideas transferred there as well. When the Muslims conquer Jerusalem in 638, they build, the Temple Mount is desolate. That's because, remember, the Christians had left the Temple Mount desolate specifically to emphasize that Christ's prophecy of the destruction of the temple had been fulfilled. So when the Muslims come, there's a big empty space there, and they take the opportunity to build for themselves a shrine, which is the rebuilding of Solomon's temple, and this is, of course, the Dome of the Rock. So here is the Temple Mount today. This is the Dome of the Rock, and this is Al-Aqsa Mosque. Two separate shrines on the area. This one is more or less where Solomon's temple originally was. And for the early Muslims, they saw themselves as simply rebuilding the mosque, the Temple of Solomon. This is what they conceived of, the building being. Here's a very interesting medieval Christian depiction of this, where Omar, depicted here, is building the Dome of the Rock, which of course is a medieval cathedral from the medieval perspective. So this story was widely known even in the West, as shown by this depiction. Here's the Dome of the Rock as it is today. It's a splendid shrine, one of the great architectural and artistic monuments in the world. Here's the interior, with the rock down below is simply an open space. Nobody is allowed to go onto it, but you circumambulate this rock just as you circumambulate the Kaaba at Mecca, as we talked about earlier. And then there's a beautiful golden dome above this, symbolizing the heavenly realm, so that the rock itself is the pathway through which you can ascend into heaven. So the shrine is dedicated mainly to Muhammad's ascent into heaven from Jerusalem, but is also the rebuilding of the temple itself. Now notice, the Dome of the Rock for centuries remained a symbol of the temple for Christians and Jews. Even though it was a Muslim building, they said, well, this is on where the temple was, this is the temple, and so they depict the temple as the Dome of the Rock. Here's a 19th century Jewish amulet in which you see the Dome of the Rock depicted here, but everything's talking about Jerusalem and so forth. This is all from the Jewish perspective, and yet they use the dome as the symbol of their temple. So this became a widespread transformation of the meaning of the temple through the building of the Dome of the Rock. The Sufis are Muslim mystics, and this is another permutation of temple ideology, because the Sufis often use stories of Solomon in association with their mystical interpretations of things. Specifically, we have the example of Jalaluddin Rumi, who tells the allegory of the building of Solomon's temple as the allegory of the transformation of the soul. So they take this into a mystical meaning here. We have another famous Muslim mystic named Ibn al-Arabi, who describes his mystical ascents into heaven, and where he has visions of the celestial temple. So a lot of this imagery gets carried on through Muslim mystics as well, and also in architecture. Here's a fountain at Alhambra which uses 12 lions as the base, imitating the 12 oxen that held the brazen sea at Solomon's temple. The Muslims ruled the Temple Mount for centuries and added lots of buildings to beautify it in many ways. This is the Fountain of Kite Bay, which is essentially like the Brazen Sea. It is a place for water to be stored where you can come to do ablutions and purifications before you go in and worship. The Solomon's Temple, its meaning and importance was transformed in modern times, and we'll have to go through this quickly because we're running out of time. But here you can see the Dome of the Rock as the temple, and beyond this you have Christ's crucifixion, symbolizing then that it is the fulfillment of temple sacrifice. So this is a typically medieval idea, an allegory that is going to be transformed in early modern times. Allegorization is one of the key ways that Christians understood the temple, and John Bunyan, for example, is a classic example of this. In 1688, he wrote Solomon's Temple Spiritualized, and it's in which everything is a symbol of Christ, everything in the temple. Paintings depict the temple in many different ways in the Renaissance and early modern times. Here is Perugino depicts it as the Dome of the Rock. So the temple at the time of Christ is the Dome of the Rock. That's how it's understood. Here, however, Botticelli depicts the temple as if it were a Renaissance cathedral, like the Cathedral of Siena. And this is Christ's temptation on the pinnacle of the temple. Clearly, then, you've got that parallel. Jan van Scorel, a Dutch painter, however, went to the Holy Land and did sketches of the Temple Mount. And so when he paints Christ's triumphal entry into Jerusalem, he depicts the Temple Mount as the contemporary 16th century Haram al-Sharif, where the Dome of the Rock is. And there's the Dome of the Rock as the temple. Other people, however, take more fantastical views. And here you've got the temple depicted as this giant ziggurat-like structure with stairs and ramps leading up. So, you know, imagination was often used to try to understand what the temple was like just as much as historical sources. Villapando depicts the temple, Ezekiel's temple, as if it were this ornate Baroque masterpiece. Every generation seems to depict the temple as their own particular type of building. Here's the Holy of Holies as depicted by Villapando. Some, however, move towards attempting to make more realistic depictions, and this is Vatablus' depiction of the temple, where it is more or less as modern scholars have come to understand it through archaeology and so forth. So even by the 16th century, people are beginning to understand and reinterpret the temple in new ways. We'll have to skip some of this stuff for lack of time. The temple was also picked up by esoteric thinkers to be symbolic of all sorts of different interesting things. Sir Isaac Newton, the famous physicist, was also very much into mystical speculation, and he wrote a book in which he saw the measurements of Solomon's temple, which he depicts here, as symbolic of God's ideas about the nature and the universe and mathematics all combined together. So the Temple of Solomon was a model, a physical model of the universe. If you understood it, you could better understand physics. Magicians used Solomonic imagery all the time. Remember, Solomon is the master of the devils and the demons. So they used the seal of Solomon, which is this six-pointed star, as a seal that can bind and control demons. And lots of magical texts are associated with this. The most famous magical texts are called the Key of Solomon or Solomon's Grimoire, things like this, because they claim to be originally written by Solomon. People also use magic circles as sacred space. Magicians invoke the name of the Lord just as the high priest did. Here's a description of how to make a magic circle from Pseudo-Agrippa, and he says, when you're consecrating any place or magic circle, you ought to take the prayer Solomon used in the dedication of the temple. Invoke the throne of God, the tabernacle, the altar, and so forth. So when they were doing their magic, they saw themselves as as recreating the temple and using the powers of Solomon to control the demons and so forth. Masons, of course, also used lots of Solomonic imagery, and the basic legend and myth of Freemasonry is about the building of the temple by Solomon and Hiram Abiff, his architect. Here you have this type of motif depicted in medieval art, where Solomon is instructing Hiram Abiff how to build it. He's got the architect's square there in his hand, and this is a parallel, a type for Christ building the church. So here the temple is Dome of the Rock again in the background, and here's the Ark of the Covenant. The Masons used temple imagery in a lot of their art in all sorts of different ways. Here's the temple, the Ark, the incense altar, the menorah, etc., and then some Masonic symbols up here. Likewise, on Masonic aprons used, you have this one depicting the elements of the Holy of Holies. Here's God's presence. Here's the Ark of the Covenant. Here are cherubim. Here's Holiness to the Lord, the words inscribed on the high priest's plate and so forth. Some of the early explorers and archaeologists of Jerusalem were Masons, and when Wilson found his famous arch in Jerusalem, he found this little chamber there, which he believed was the place where the Masons first originated, back in Solomon's time. So they named it Freemasons' Hall, and it's still, if you go to Wilson's arch and know that the corner to go around, you can still see Freemasons' Hall here, where the Masons believe, the first Masons met. Another famous mythology of the temple is Neo-Templar ideas, that the Templars, who were these knights that lived on the Temple Mount, dug up some strange secret or treasure of Solomon's. They carried it back to Europe. When they were suppressed by the King of France, they went underground, they kept this secret, and then they still exist today, having this secret treasure or ideas. And this is reflected, of course, in the Da Vinci Code, where the Templars are part of the group that is secretly hiding the identity of Mary Magdalene and so forth. In the modern world, the temple is still playing an important role. Artists in the 19th century attempted to reconstruct it, as Tissot does here in his painting, but much of this is fantasy, because it's not really till the early 20th century that archaeology begins to excavate and discover what Solomon's temple was really like. Here is Tissot's depiction of the Ark of the Covenant. Very famous painter of the late 19th century, and this, of course, enters into popular culture because the Raiders of the Lost Ark uses that painting as its model for the Ark in that movie. Much archaeology has been done, and there's a great deal of new scholarship from interpretations of texts, new finds, and so forth. This is part of the old temple wall, the southern wall of Herod's temple that's been excavated since the 1960s. Here is an archway that with a gate that led into the temple. These are the walls, the old retaining walls of Herod's temple. So a great deal of archaeology has been done in the 19th mainly the 20th century that helps understand the temple much better today. The temple is also a real problem for people right today because it is intimately involved in the Arab-Israeli conquest. And here you have the seal of the state of Israel, which is from Zechariah's vision of the temple, from Zechariah 4, of the menorah and the olive trees. So although most Israelis today are rather secular, and they're not really thinking mainly about rebuild soldiers to bring a bunch of explosives and blow up the Dome of the Rock right on the spot so that they could rebuild the temple at that moment. Some other Israeli soldiers, they had kind of a fight and a scuffle up there, and they stopped them from doing this, and Moshe Dayan returned the Temple Mount to the Muslims. But they were on the verge of blowing up the Dome of the Rock to rebuild the third temple right on the spot when they captured it. There's movements in Israel today, especially the Temple Mount faithful, that want to rebuild the third temple. And here are the cornerstones they've cut that they try to take up on the Temple Mount once in a while. They're ready to rebuild right now. And of course, evangelical Christians are in this as well. If you've read Left Behind series, they talk about Antichrist building temples and stuff like this, as do others who reflect on how the temple's going to be rebuilt in the last days for these types of things. Fundamentally, then, we have a problem with the Temple Mount. It's had a huge history. It's been reflected in many different ways, in many different cultures, and understood and interpreted and transmogrified in all sorts of different ways. But right now, we are left with a political problem of what to do with that Temple Mount as a Middle Eastern crisis. The prophets wanted it to be a prayer for all nations, and yet we have this paradox of this struggle for different people for sole control of the Temple Mount. And if we're ever going to have a Middle Eastern peace, that issue of the Temple Mount of Jerusalem is going to be one of the key issues that face politicians of how we resolve that. So for 3,000 years, this place has been fought over, died for, envisioned and painted and in many different ways, and it remains one of the most enduring cultural icons of our civilization. Thank you very much.